The silence in First Baptist Church of Caldwell, Kansas fell so hard and so sudden that Delia Beckett could hear her own heartbeat hammering behind her sternum like a trapped animal throwing itself against its cage. She stood at the front of that narrow aisle, her hands folded in front of her so that no one could see them trembling, and she looked up at the congregation staring back at her with eyes that ranged from pity to contempt to the particular kind of hungry satisfaction that small towns reserve for a public reckoning. It was the summer of 1883, and the heat had been building for 3 weeks in more ways than one. Pastor Gerald Holt stood behind his pulpit with a sheet of paper in his hand, and he was reading from it in that slow, deliberate voice he used when he wanted the weight of each word to press down on the listener like a thumb on a wound. He was reading aloud the petition, 37 signatures, 37 names from citizens of Caldwell requesting that Delia Beckett be formally removed from her position as schoolteacher at the Caldwell Township School on the grounds of moral unsuitability, conduct unbecoming a woman of good character, and what he termed with his careful preacher's vocabulary, a history of deception regarding the origins of her person. Delia did not cry. She had made herself a promise that morning when she pinned up her dark hair and buttoned her blue dress to the collar. She was not going to cry. She could feel the gaze of Vera Aldridge from the third pew, the woman who had started the petition, whose thin mouth was pressed so tightly together it had nearly disappeared from her face. She could feel the embarrassment of the school board chairman, Harold Finch, who sat 2 rows behind Vera and had not looked directly at Delia since this had all begun. She could feel the particular absence of warmth from people who had smiled at her on the street not 3 weeks ago, before someone had sent a letter to Vera Aldridge containing information that Delia had spent the better part of 6 years burying. The pastor finished reading. He set the paper down. He looked at her over his spectacles and asked, as if it were a formality, whether anyone present wished to speak in defense of Miss Beckett before the congregation made its recommendation to the school board. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence went on long enough that Delia felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack at the corners, felt the burn starting behind her eyes that meant tears were coming whether she had made promises to herself or not. And then, from the 5th pew on the left side, a man stood up. He was not the sort of man who made speeches. Everybody in that church knew that. Roscoe Sawyer had attended First Baptist for 6 years and had never once raised his voice in any public meeting, never lingered after service to argue theology or gossip about his neighbors, never done anything to draw attention to himself at all. He ran his cattle spread, the Double S Ranch, about 4 miles east of town, paid his taxes, tipped his hat to ladies, and largely let the world go about its business without him. He was broad-shouldered and lean, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair going slightly silver at the temples, and when he stood up, he was tall enough that his head was the highest point in the room by a clear margin. He stood and he looked at Pastor Holt, and he said in a voice that was quiet but carried all the way to the back wall without any effort, "I'd like to speak." And nobody in that church expected it, not a single soul. What came next would change everything for Delia Beckett. But to understand why it mattered so much, and why the man who stood up was the very last person anyone would have anticipated, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the morning 6 weeks earlier when Delia Beckett arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, carrying a single leather trunk and a very carefully maintained secret, and found herself face to face with a man who was watering his horse at the public trough on Main Street, and who did not speak to her, but who looked at her with dark eyes that seemed to be calculating something private and entirely his own. Delia had come to Caldwell by train from St. Louis, though St. Louis was not where she had started. She had started in a small town called Guthrie Junction in the Oklahoma Territory, and she had left Guthrie Junction with the kind of speed that did not allow for careful goodbyes. She was 26 years old. She had a teaching certificate earned through 2 years of study and 1 year of correspondence, and she had a secret that she had decided was simply never going to come up if she managed herself correctly. The secret was this. Her father, James Beckett, had been a man of mixed heritage, half white and half black, born free in St. Louis in 1831, and dead of a riding accident in 1879 when Delia was 22. Her mother, Clara Beckett, had been a white woman from Georgia who had loved James Beckett with a fierceness that scandalized her family, and who had died when Delia was 8, taking with her the one person who had made the world feel safe. Delia had grown up in a particular liminal space, light-skinned enough to pass, educated enough to be useful, clever enough to understand that the world she lived in 1883 had very specific and brutal opinions about who she was and what she was worth. She had not set out to deceive anyone. She had simply answered the advertisement for a schoolteacher in Caldwell, Kansas, submitted her credentials, received the position, and arrived. She had not volunteered information that nobody had asked for. She had not lied exactly. She had simply allowed the world to see what it expected to see, because the alternative was too costly to contemplate. Caldwell in 1883 was a cattle town at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, loud and profitable and full of contradictions. Cowboys drove longhorns up from Texas on the Kisham Trail and arrived sunburned and trail-worn, and spent their wages in the saloons on 5th Street. Merchants grew wealthy, churches multiplied. The town had a newspaper, a hotel, a livery stable, 2 dry goods stores, a doctor, and a school that sat on the corner of Main and Walnut and educated the children of ranchers and shopkeepers from September through May. It was at that school that Delia threw herself into her work with the intensity of a woman who understood that being excellent at her job was her best protection. She learned the children's names within the first week. She was firm but patient, creative with her lessons, and the parents noticed. Within a month, people were saying that Miss Beckett was the best teacher Caldwell had seen in years. She had been in town for 2 weeks when she first spoke properly to Roscoe Sawyer. She had seen him before that, of course. Caldwell was not so large that you could avoid seeing the same people regularly. She had seen him at the general store run by Marcus Holt, the pastor's brother, where Roscoe came twice a month for supplies. She had noted him in the way she noted all the men in town, which was to say carefully, and with the particular wariness of a woman who had learned that men in positions of social authority could either protect you or destroy you with roughly equal probability. What she had decided about Roscoe Sawyer from observation was that he was private, competent, and largely uninterested in other people's business. He was 32, she learned later, and he had come to Caldwell 7 years ago from somewhere further west, bought his land, built his operation, and established himself as a reliable and productive member of the ranching community without ever becoming what you would call a social creature. He had no wife. He had no obvious close friends, though he was on cordial terms with most people. He was not unfriendly. He was simply contained. She actually spoke to him for the first time outside Marcus Holt's general store on a Wednesday afternoon in late May. She had been purchasing chalk and writing paper for her classroom, and had emerged to find her path partially blocked by a crate of canned goods being unloaded from a wagon. She was attempting to navigate around it when the crate shifted, and a can rolled toward the edge of the boardwalk. She reached for it at the same moment he did, and their hands nearly collided above the falling can before he caught it cleanly and held it out to her. "Thank you," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That should have been the end of it." That would have been the end of it with almost any other man in Caldwell. But something made her look up at him directly instead of moving on immediately, and something made him not look away when she did. And there was a very brief moment where two people who were both, in their separate ways, accustomed to keeping the world at a careful distance, looked at each other and registered something. She did not know what to call it. She was not the kind of woman who went around believing in romantic notions. She had seen what love could cost. She had watched her mother lose everything for love. She had a job to do and a life to maintain, and she was not going to complicate it. She moved on. He tipped his hat. That was all, except that she thought about it on the walk home and did not fully understand why. The next 2 weeks continued in the same quiet way. She saw him at church on Sunday. He sat in his usual place. He did not seek her out after service, but when he happened to pass her on the way out, he said good morning with the same kind of direct, uncomplicated courtesy he showed to everyone, and she found herself studying his face for something she could not name. It was Tommy Hadley who brought them together properly. Tommy was 9 years old, the son of a wheat farmer on the outskirts of town, and he was by some margin the most difficult child in Delia's classroom. Not because he was bad, she had explained this to his father twice already, but because he was deeply intelligent and terminally bored by the pace of the regular lessons. He spent his time drawing horses in the margins of his slate and getting into arguments with the boy beside him. His father, Bill Hadley, was a tired man with too much land and not enough time, and his solution to Tommy's behavior in school was a belt and a short temper. Delia had been keeping Tommy after class to give him additional work, harder problems, longer reading assignments, things that would occupy his mind properly, and it had been working. But one afternoon in early June, Tommy had not appeared for the extra session. She had waited 20 minutes and then walked the road toward the Hadley farm to check on him, because something in his manner that morning had worried her. She found him sitting on the fence of the pasture that bordered the Double S ranch, staring at nothing, with his boots swinging and his jaw set in the particular way that means a child is refusing to cry. She stopped. She sat down on the fence beside him without saying anything, which was the right instinct, and waited. After a while he said, "Mr. Sawyer lets me watch his horses sometimes." She looked across the pasture and saw Roscoe Sawyer's place in the distance, the clean lines of a well-maintained ranch, a barn painted red, a house that was modest but solid. She said, "Does he know you come here?" Tommy shrugged, which was not an answer. Then he said, "He does now. He came out one morning and found me on the fence, and I thought he was going to run me off, but he just came and stood beside me and said, 'That bay mare is going to foal in about a week and a half.' And I said, 'Really?' And he said, 'You want to see when she does?' And I said, 'Yes.'" Delia listened to this and felt something shift in her understanding of Roscoe Sawyer. "Tommy," she said carefully, "is something wrong at home?" The boy's jaw tightened further. He did not answer, but the silence was its own kind of answer. She did not push him. She sat with him on that fence for another quarter-hour, watching the horses move in the pasture, and then she walked him back toward the road and made sure he went in the direction of home. She stood there after he had gone, thinking. Behind her, from across the pasture, she heard footsteps on dry grass and turned to find Roscoe Sawyer walking toward her from the direction of his barn, unhurried, his thumbs hooked in his belt. He stopped a respectful distance away. He said, "I saw you sitting with Tommy." "He seems troubled," she said. Roscoe nodded once and looked toward the road where Tommy had gone. "Bill Hadley is a hard man," he said, with a neutrality that somehow communicated a great deal. "Have you spoken to anyone about it?" she asked. He looked at her then with those direct dark eyes, and there was something in his expression that was not quite surprise but was close to it, as if he had not expected her to press the point. He said, "There is not a lot that talking does in Caldwell when a father decides how to handle his own son. The law sees it one way." "That does not mean nothing can be done," she said. He studied her for a moment. He said, "No, it does not mean that." That was the beginning. Not of romance, not yet, nothing that either of them would have named as romance at that stage. It was the beginning of something simpler and in some ways more durable, which was respect. They found themselves on the same side of a question about Tommy Hadley, and being on the same side of something is a powerful place to start. Over the following 2 weeks, by what seemed like coincidence but was perhaps not entirely coincidental, they encountered each other several more times in contexts related to Tommy. Delia had taken it upon herself to speak with Bill Hadley, which had gone poorly, but had served notice that someone was watching. Roscoe, she discovered, had quietly offered Tommy work on the Double S on Saturday mornings, giving the boy somewhere safe to be and a small amount of money that was his own. The third time Delia happened to walk past the Double S fence and found Roscoe there, both of them ostensibly checking on the mare who was nearing her foaling date. They started talking and continued for nearly an hour. She learned that he had come from Arizona Territory originally, that he had worked for other ranchers for 5 years before saving enough to buy his own land, and that he had a quiet passion for horses that went beyond their utility as work animals. He asked her where she had taught before. She said St. Louis, which was partly true. He asked her what had brought her to Caldwell specifically. She said the position had been advertised and it seemed like a good fit. She did not tell him the rest. She was not ready to tell anyone the rest. She noticed in those weeks that he never pushed her for more than she offered. He answered her questions readily but did not volunteer more than was asked, which meant they were both, in their separate ways, people who understood the value of held information. It was oddly comfortable. It was like finding someone who spoke the same careful language she had developed over years of navigating a world that required her to be strategic about her own truth. She also noticed, without letting herself acknowledge it directly, that she looked forward to seeing him. That when she was walking on a given morning, she was aware of whether her route would take her past the Double S or not. That when he was at church and she could see the back of his head 2 rows ahead, she felt something that she absolutely refused to call anything at all. The mare foaled on a Saturday. Tommy was there for it, which Roscoe had promised he would be. Delia had not been invited exactly, but when she walked out that morning she somehow ended up at the Double S fence and Roscoe had seen her and said, simply, "Come on then," as if it were the natural conclusion to something, and she had opened the gate and gone in. The foal was a chestnut with white on 3 feet, and it was on the ground and trying to stand within minutes of arriving in the world, spindly-legged and wildly determined. Tommy watched with his whole face open in a way that erased the careful guardedness he wore at school, and Delia watched Tommy, and she felt the specific ache of caring about a child's well-being as more than a professional obligation. Roscoe stood beside her in the barn doorway while Tommy crouched near the foal, and he said quietly, "He is a good kid." "He is a remarkable kid," she said. "He just needs someone to see it." Roscoe said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I know something about that." She looked at him. He was looking at the boy and the foal, not at her, and she could not read his expression entirely, but she recognized the quality of what he had just said. It was the quality of a truth offered without armor, briefly and without ceremony, and then returned to silence. She did not ask him to explain it. She let it stand. She thought about it later, alone in her rented room above the Caldwell boarding house, lying on top of her quilt in the summer heat with the window open and the sound of cicadas coming in from the street below. She thought about his hands, which were the working hands of a man who had spent his adult life in physical labor, but which moved with a particular precision when he was doing something he cared about, like checking a foal's legs or adjusting a bridle. She thought about the way he talked to Tommy, which was exactly even, no condescension, no performance of adult authority, just one person talking to another person about something that mattered. She thought about the moment in the barn when he had offered that fragment of his own experience and her complete understanding of what it cost him. She told herself very firmly to be sensible. The problem with being sensible, she was finding, was that her heart was not a sensible organ. In the first week of July, 2 things happened that changed the trajectory of everything. The first was that Vera Aldridge's sister wrote a letter from Guthrie Junction, Oklahoma Territory. Vera's sister was married to a man who had known the Beckett family, who had known James Beckett, and who had passed along certain information about Delia's parentage with the enthusiastic malice of someone who has found something useful. Vera Aldridge received this letter on a Monday, and by Wednesday had shown it to 4 people. Delia did not know this yet. She would not know it for another week. The second thing that happened in the first week of July was that Roscoe Sawyer came to her classroom door on a Friday afternoon after the children had gone and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and asked if she would like to ride out with him on Sunday afternoon after church service. Not in a crowd, just the two of them. He asked it simply and directly without flourish, and he looked at her with those eyes that were always measuring something private, and he waited. She said yes before she had finished deciding to say it. She spent the rest of Friday and all of Saturday telling herself it was nothing, just a neighborly ride. People in Caldwell did this. It was not uncommon. She spent Sunday morning sitting in church, acutely aware of the back of his head 2 rows ahead, and not listening to a single word Pastor Holt said. After service, they rode east out of town along the creek road, her on the gray horse she hired from the livery and him on his own big black gelding. The afternoon was hot and brilliant, the prairie grass going golden at the tips, the sky enormous and full of the kind of towering white clouds that made you feel both small and exhilarated. They rode mostly in comfortable silence for the first half-mile, which was somehow better than conversation would have been, because it told her that he was not someone who needed to fill space with noise. When they did talk, they talked about the land, about how the creek had run higher 2 years ago before the drought, about the cattle market, and whether the railroad expansion was going to change things in Caldwell. They talked about books, which surprised her, because he mentioned having recently finished a collection of Tennyson's poems in a way that was offhand, as if he assumed she would not find it remarkable, and she found it remarkable. She mentioned Whittier. He said he preferred Tennyson. They argued about it with the happy energy of people who are arguing because arguing is a form of intimacy when you trust the other person. She had not trusted anyone in a very long time. At some point they stopped along the creek bank and let the horses drink, and they stood a few feet apart, and she was aware of him with every nerve she had, which was inconvenient and true. He was looking at the water, and he said, without turning toward her, "I am glad you came to Caldwell." She said, "Are you?" "Yes," he said, and he looked at her then, and there it was, the thing she had been refusing to name. It was there in his expression without any pretense at all, direct and serious and certain, and it was terrifying in the best way she had ever been terrified. She said, "You do not know me very well yet, Mr. Sawyer." He said, "No, but I am working on it." She looked back at the water. She said, "There are things about me that are complicated." He said, "I expect most things worth anything are." She did not tell him then. She wanted to. She was closer to telling him than she had been to telling anyone in years, and the only thing that stopped her was the habit of self-protection, deep-grained and reflexive. She needed more time. She needed to be certain. She would not get the time she thought she needed. They rode back to town as the sun began to lower, and he left her at the boarding house with a courtesy that was also, in its quiet way, a form of warmth. She went up to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands against her cheeks, and felt the particular joyful panic of a person who has been careful for a long time and can feel the careful structure beginning to come apart. The following Tuesday, Vera Aldridge stopped Delia on the street outside the post office. Vera was 52, the wife of the chairman of the town's commercial association, and she had the precise, careful manner of a woman who has made a hobby of other people's standing. She had always been pleasant to Delia in the surface way that concealed an ongoing assessment. On this Tuesday she was not pleasant. She stopped directly in front of Delia on the boardwalk and looked at her with eyes that had made their decision before any conversation began, and she said, "Miss Beckett, I think it is time we had an honest conversation." What followed was not a conversation. It was an accusation wrapped in the language of civic concern. Vera had the letter from her sister. She had shown it to enough people to be fairly certain that the ground was prepared. She told Delia what she knew, and she watched Delia's face as she said it with the attention of a scientist observing a reaction. Delia stood very still. She did not deny it. She did not confirm it. She said, in a voice that was steadier than she felt, "I suggest that whatever you are planning, you consider carefully what it is you are actually objecting to." Vera's mouth thinned. She said, "What I am objecting to is deception. You came here under false pretenses." "I came here with a teaching certificate and 7 years of experience," Delia said. "What pretense did I offer that was false?" Vera had no clean answer to that, which made her angrier. She said, "People have a right to know who is educating their children." Delia said, "I am educating their children. That is who I am." And she walked away, which was the only dignified option, and which she accomplished without her knees buckling, which she considered something of a miracle. She went home and she sat in her room, and she was honest with herself about what was coming. She had seen versions of this before. She knew how quickly a community could turn when it decided it had been deceived, even when the deception was more of a silence than a lie. She knew the specific and bitter injustice of being condemned for the facts of her birth as if they were a character failing, as if her father's blood was a contamination she had maliciously introduced into the bloodstream of polite society. She was angry. She was frightened. And underneath both of those, she was tired. She was so deeply tired of carrying this careful performance, this constant calibration of what to say and what to hide and how to present herself, so that the world would allow her to simply exist and do her work. She thought about Roscoe. She thought about the Sunday ride and his voice saying, "I am glad you came to Caldwell." She thought about telling him before someone else did. She did not do it that night. She told herself she needed to think about how. She told herself she would find the right moment. She had 2 days before the moment was taken from her. By Thursday, the petition was circulating. By Friday, she knew it had 37 signatures. By Saturday, Pastor Holt had informed her that the matter would be brought before the congregation on Sunday as a formal community proceeding, which was within his authority under the church's governance structure, and which served, in practical terms, as a town tribunal. If the congregation recommended to the school board that she be removed, the board would almost certainly comply, because the school board served the community, and the community was, apparently, Vera Aldridge. She told herself she would face it. She told herself she was entitled to face it with her head up. She spent Saturday evening writing a statement, a careful, measured defense of her credentials and her record, and she read it back to herself and thought it was good and thought it probably would not be enough and went to bed anyway. She did not sleep. She did not see Roscoe between Tuesday and Sunday. This was not by accident. She had been avoiding the routes and times where their paths were likely to cross, because she was afraid of what she would read in his face when he looked at her now that the story was out, and because she was more afraid of what she would feel if he was not changed by it. She was afraid of hope. Hope, in her experience, was a trap. Sunday morning came in hot and white, the kind of July morning in Kansas that felt like standing inside a furnace. Delia dressed carefully. She pinned her hair. She buttoned her blue dress. She made her promise about crying. She walked to church. The congregation assembled with the particular subdued energy of people who know they are attending something that is not exactly a church service. There was more talking than usual before Pastor Holt called them to order, more glancing in her direction, more of the dense social electricity that precedes a public drama. Delia sat in her usual place in the 4th pew on the right side, alone, and she kept her eyes forward and her hands folded, and she breathed. The service was brief. When it was over, instead of the benediction, Pastor Holt moved directly into the matter at hand. He introduced the petition. He read it aloud. The 37 signatures, the language about moral unsuitability and deception. He read it all the way through in his careful, measured voice, and the church was so quiet that Delia could hear the sound of the summer wind pushing against the windows. When he was done, he set the paper down. He asked if anyone wished to speak in defense of Miss Beckett. Nobody moved. The silence was the worst thing she had experienced in a long time, worse than Vera's ambush on the street, worse than the days of waiting. because silence in that moment was the sound of 37 people, and everyone else in the room deciding that she was not worth the social cost of speaking up. She was alone in that church in a way that went beyond physical solitude, and she felt it in her chest like a hand pressing down. And then Roscoe Sawyer stood up. He stood in the fifth pew on the left, and he did it with the unhurried certainty of a man who has made a decision and is not reconsidering it. And every head in the church turned toward him, and the silence had a different quality now, a stunned quality, because everyone in that room knew that Roscoe Sawyer did not make speeches. He said, "I would like to speak," and he said it in that quiet voice that carried without effort. Pastor Holt blinked. He said, "Mr. Sawyer, the floor is yours." Roscoe did not move to the front. He did not need to. He simply stood where he was in his pew, and he looked at Pastor Holt, and then he looked at Vera Aldridge, and then he looked at the congregation, and then he turned slightly and looked at Delia herself, and what she saw in his face when he looked at her was not pity and was not performance and was not calculation. It was something straightforward and fierce and sure. He said, "I have listened to what has been read, and I want to say several things plainly." The church was absolutely still. He said, "I have known Miss Beckett since May. I have watched her teach. I have watched her treat the children of this town with patience and intelligence and genuine care. I watched her fight for Tommy Hadley when no one else was paying attention to what that boy needed. I watched her grade papers at 7 in the morning and stay an hour after school to help a child who was struggling with his numbers. I have never once observed her conduct herself in any manner that was less than professional and kind and thoroughly suited to the position she holds." He paused. He let that land. Then he said, "This petition calls her deceptive. I would like to know what she deceived anyone about. She came here with legitimate credentials. She has done her job with exceptional ability. The question of her parentage is a fact about her birth, not about her character. And if this congregation believes those are the same thing, then I would ask every person in this room to examine that belief very carefully before they put it into action." Vera Aldridge made a sound that was not quite words. Pastor Holt held up a hand. Roscoe continued, and his voice was still level, still quiet, still carrying. "I was raised to believe that a person is measured by what they do and how they treat others. I was raised in a Baptist church not unlike this one, and I was taught that judgment belongs to the Lord and not to a committee. I am asking this congregation to look at what Miss Beckett has actually done and not at what she was born into, and to ask yourselves whether what you are about to recommend is just." He stopped. He sat down. He did it all with the same unhurried certainty with which he had risen. For a moment nothing happened. Then Harold Finch, the school board chairman who had been unable to look at Delia for a week, cleared his throat. He said slowly, "I think Mr. Sawyer raises some fair points." Vera Aldridge turned to look at him with an expression that could have cured Ham. Harold Finch met her eyes and did not flinch, which was the bravest thing Delia had ever seen that particular man do. The church erupted into the low, rolling sound of a congregation reconsidering. Not all of them. Not even most of them, not immediately. But enough of them, enough voices murmuring in the rows, enough people shifting in their seats. The pastor called for order. He said the matter would be taken under advisement by the church's deacons and referred to the school board for a formal decision, which everyone understood meant that it was not going to result in an immediate removal. It was not a victory. But it was not the execution that Vera Aldridge had planned. Delia sat in her pew and looked at her folded hands and breathed very carefully through the trembling that was working its way up from somewhere below her sternum. She would not cry. She had promised. When the service ended and people began to file out, there was a complicated social traffic around her. Some people avoided her carefully. A few stopped to say something, awkwardly, in the careful language of people who wanted to signal something without quite committing to it. Harold Finch stopped and said quietly that he expected she would be hearing from the school board within the week and that he would be speaking on her behalf. She thanked him. She waited. She did not see Roscoe in the departing crowd, and she thought he must have slipped out quickly. She was oddly bereft by this, which was not rational. He had just stood up in front of the entire congregation on her behalf, and she was disappointed not to see him immediately afterward, which was simply proof that the heart is not a sensible organ under any circumstances. She walked out of the church and down the steps and into the white blast of the July sun, and she had made it about 20 feet down the street when she heard his voice behind her. "Miss Beckett." She stopped and turned. He was standing at the bottom of the church steps, hat in hand, and he was looking at her with that direct gaze that she had come to understand was simply his natural mode. This was how he looked at things he took seriously. He walked toward her and stopped a proper few feet away, and he said, "How are you?" It was not quite a question. It was more like a check on something he was already monitoring. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I think you know how I am." He nodded once. She said, "Why did you do that?" He held her gaze. He said, "Because it was the right thing to do and nobody else was going to." "That is not the whole reason," she said, and she was surprised at herself for saying it, surprised at the certainty with which she said it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, it is not the whole reason." She looked away and then back at him. She said, "I should have told you before it came out the way it did. I was going to tell you." "I know," he said, and then, "it would not have changed anything." She felt something in her chest pull loose with a pain that was also, somehow, relief. The kind of release that comes when you have been holding a weight so long that you have forgotten what it felt like to breathe fully, and then you are finally allowed to set it down. She said, "It changes things for people, Mr. Sawyer. It has changed things for people before." He said, "Then those were the wrong people." She had no answer for that. She pressed her lips together and looked at him and thought about the barn and Tommy's face and Sunday afternoon on the creek road and the way he had said, "I am glad you came to Caldwell," and she thought she was going to cry after all despite all her promises to herself. She did not cry. She said, "Thank you for what you said in there. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that it mattered." He said, "I know it mattered. What I want to know is if you will have dinner with me on Friday evening." She stared at him. He stood perfectly still and waited with the patience of a man who has said what he meant to say and is prepared to accept the answer without drama. She said, "You are asking me to dinner?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. She almost laughed. She bit it back. She said, "That is a very strange thing to ask a woman immediately after defending her at a tribunal." He said, "I have been meaning to ask since the creek road. The timing is not ideal, but I did not want to wait any longer." She said yes. She said it the same way she had said yes to the Sunday ride, before she had quite finished deciding, because apparently her mouth knew what her heart wanted even when her mind was still composing objections. The week that followed was complicated and difficult and important. The school board met on Wednesday. Harold Finch had spoken to each board member privately in the 2 days following the church proceedings, and Roscoe had also made it known, without making a public scene about it, that he stood by his characterization of Delia's work. 2 other members of the community had come forward with their own supporting statements, parents of her students who had watched her teach their children, and who had decided that what she had accomplished in her classroom mattered more than what Vera Aldridge had decided to make matter. The vote was 3-2 in favor of retaining her position. It was not unanimous. It was not a clean exoneration. But it was a vote, and it went the way it went, and when Harold Finch sent her the formal letter confirming her continued employment, Delia sat at her desk in her empty classroom after all the children had gone home, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just been decided. She let herself feel the anger at the fact that it had needed to be decided at all, that her qualifications and her record had had to be weighed against the accident of her parentage by a committee of men. She let herself feel the grief of that injustice, the particular exhausting grief of having to prove your worthiness to people who had never questioned their own worthiness for a single day of their lives. And then she let herself feel the gratitude, not the simple, uncomplicated gratitude of someone who had been rescued, because she did not experience it that way. She had fought for herself. She had stood in that church without breaking. She had held her head up through all of it. What Roscoe had done was not rescue, it was witness. He had stood up and named the truth in a room full of people who were pretending the truth was something else. And there is a difference between someone saving you and someone standing beside you, and she knew which one she needed and which one he had offered. Friday came. He arrived at the boarding house at 6 in the evening, and he was wearing a clean shirt and his good hat, and he had clearly made an effort, which she found deeply endearing. She was wearing the other dress, the green one, which was her best. They walked to the hotel dining room on Main Street, which was the finest dining available in Caldwell in 1883, which was to say it was clean and the food was good and the tablecloths were white. They talked for 2 hours. They talked the way people talk when they have been waiting to say things and are finally, tentatively, saying them. He told her about Arizona Territory, about a cattle ranch where he had worked as a young man for a boss who had been genuinely fair, who had taught him that land and animals required respect and received it in return, and about coming to Kansas with the specific intention of building something that was entirely his own. She told him about her father, about James Beckett's laugh and his love of argument and his hands, which had been capable of great tenderness and also of building things from raw material. She told him about her mother, and about being raised in the particular no-man's land between two worlds and learning to navigate both. She watched his face as she talked. He listened the way he did everything, with complete and unhurried attention, and his expression did not shift in the ways she had learned to dread. He did not look uncomfortable. He did not look as if he was managing his reaction for her benefit. He looked genuinely interested and occasionally moved, and at no point did he look at her as if the information had changed what he saw when he looked at her. She said, at some point, "You are not what I expected." He said, "What did you expect?" She considered. She said, "Someone more complicated." He said, "I am fairly simple, and then I know what I want. I have known what I want for most of my life. The question is usually whether you can get it." She looked at him across the white tablecloth. She said, "And what is it that you want, Mr. Sawyer?" He said, "Roscoe." She said, "What is it that you want, Roscoe?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "I want to keep having dinner with you. I want to keep talking to you. I want to know you the way you deserve to be known, and I want to know if you might want those things as well." She said, "I think I might." He smiled then, which was not something she had seen him do often, and it changed his face in a way that made her breath catch, because he was serious looking at rest, and then when he smiled something came loose in him that was entirely warm and entirely without armor, and she understood in that moment that he was, under all the privacy and containment, a person capable of great feeling who had learned to keep it carefully housed. Like her. They walked back from the hotel in the soft dark of the July evening, the street lamps burning their yellow circles on the dusty road, and at the door of the boarding house he took his hat off and held it at his side and looked at her and said, "Next Sunday, would you ride with me again?" She said yes. The summer turned. Tommy Hadley's situation was addressed in the way that things were addressed in small towns in 1883, which was imperfect but not without effect. Delia had spoken to the county circuit judge when he passed through Caldwell on his regular rotation, and Roscoe had backed her account of what he had observed. And while the law was not quick to intervene in a family matter, it was enough to put Bill Hadley on notice that people were watching. The man reduced his drinking. The belt was used less. Tommy began to smile more often, which was the metric Delia was measuring by. August was long and golden and full of possibility. They rode together almost every Sunday after church, and sometimes on Wednesday evenings Roscoe came to town, and they walked along the creek road in the early dark. She began to know his silences well enough to read them, to know when he was thinking something through versus when he was simply content to be quiet, which was often. He was more content in silence than anyone she had ever met, and she was beginning to find that she matched him in this, that she had spent so much of her life performing for an audience that the experience of being with someone who did not require performance was something like taking off a heavy coat she had forgotten she was wearing. He brought her wildflowers once and was so matter-of-fact about it just here, as if he were handing her a letter, that she burst out laughing, and he looked startled and then deeply pleased by the laugh, and she thought she had never felt so precisely herself in another person's presence. On a Wednesday evening in late August, they stopped along the creek road at the place where they usually turned back, and he said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. He said, "My mother was Cherokee. My father was white. I grew up in the territory, and I know what it costs to be a person who does not fit neatly into what the world has decided you are supposed to be." He paused. He was looking at the water. He said, "I have kept that quiet in Caldwell, not because I am ashamed, because I learned early that it changes the way people treat you, and I wanted to build my ranch without the weight of their opinions on top of everything else." She was very still. She said, "When did you decide to tell me?" He said, "About 3 weeks ago. I was waiting for the right time. And then I thought about you waiting for the right time. And I thought that neither of us had that luxury, and that we should just say the true things." She looked at him in the fading light, this man who had stood up in church on her behalf, who had offered her his silence and his honesty in equal measure, who had just handed her the hidden piece of himself with the same unhurried certainty with which he did everything. And she felt something she had not let herself feel in so long she had almost forgotten the shape of it, which was the feeling of being fully met, of not being alone in the particular way she had been alone. She reached out and took his hand. He looked down at her hand and then up at her face, and his expression was something she was going to carry with her for the rest of her life. He said, "Delia," she said, "I know." He said, "I mean to tell you that I love you. I know this is considerably faster than is strictly proper, but I am not good at pretending about things that matter." She said, "I am not fast. I am very careful, and I am telling you carefully and deliberately that I love you too." He brought her hand to his lips and pressed them to her knuckles, which was the most formal and tender gesture, and she felt it from her knuckles to her spine. He said quietly into the warm August dark, "Then I would like to ask you to marry me." She stared at him. She said, "That is extremely fast, Roscoe." He said, "I know. I can wait as long as you need. I just wanted you to know the direction I am moving in." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that a nighthawk called somewhere over the water and the stars began to be visible in the eastern sky. She was thinking about risk and about protection and about the cost of love and the cost of loneliness, and about what it felt like to be with someone who told the true things. She said, "Ask me again in the fall. After the school year begins and we have spent more time together. Ask me when the weather changes." He said, "All right." He walked her back to town and left her at the boarding house door, and she went up to her room and stood at the window for a long time looking out at the dark street and feeling the extraordinary, terrifying, wonderful thing of having been asked. September arrived, and with it the new school year and a classroom full of children who came back to her like they had been waiting all summer, including Tommy, who was taller and browner from the outdoor work, and who gave her a grin at the door that was worth more than most things she owned. Vera Aldridge did not disappear. She reduced herself, became the kind of opposition that is present but no longer powerful, the narrowed eyes across the aisle at church, the deliberate coldness on the street. Delia observed it and moved past it. She had learned, in the summer that had just passed, the difference between enemies who could hurt you and enemies who could only watch while you got on with your life. October came cold and brilliant, the Kansas plains turning their autumn colors, the evenings sharper and the sky a deeper blue than the summer could manage. One Sunday after church, Roscoe walked beside her down the main road, and they turned onto the creek path and walked without speaking for a while in the good, comfortable way they had developed, and the leaves were red and gold in the cottonwoods along the water. He said, "The weather has changed." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, but his mouth had the ghost of something in its corners. She said, "So it has." He said, "I believe I said I would ask you again when the weather changed." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The creek ran cold and clear over the stones, and a hawk circled somewhere high above, and she looked at this man, this quiet, honest, steady man who had stood up in front of 37 signatures and the entire congregation of the First Baptist Church of Caldwell, Kansas, and said the true thing because it needed to be said, and she thought that she had been alone and careful and strategic for a very long time, and she was tired of it in the best possible way. She said, "Yes." He looked at her with that direct, serious gaze and said, "Yes to the question I was about to ask." "Yes to that question," she said. He let out a breath, and she realized that for all his certainty, for all his patience, he had not been entirely sure of her answer, and the fact that he had asked anyway was its own kind of courage. He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a ring, which was simple and gold and clearly chosen with care, and he put it on her finger with the same precise gentleness with which he did everything that mattered. She looked at it on her hand, plain gold in the October light, and she thought of all the distances she had traveled to get to this particular spot on this particular creek road, and she thought that none of it, not the fear or the loneliness or the tribunal or the secrets, had been wasted, because all of it had delivered her here. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, which was the first time she had done that, and he wrapped his arms around her with a force that was careful and absolute, and they stood there by the October creek in the falling leaves and held on. They married in December. It was a small wedding, by the standards of Caldwell society, which meant it was about 40 people in the church and a dinner afterward at the hotel. Pastor Holt performed the ceremony with something that might have been residual discomfort, but was also something like genuine acknowledgement that this was the right outcome, which was as much grace as Delia expected from him, and she accepted it. Tommy Hadley was there, wearing a too large borrowed coat and looking so pleased with himself that Delia had to work to keep her face properly composed during the ceremony. Harold Finch attended and shook Roscoe's hand afterward with real warmth. Vera Aldridge was not there, which surprised no one. Roscoe's hands were warm, and his voice was steady when he said the words. And when they were done, the small congregation erupted in the kind of applause that happens when people are genuinely glad. Delia stood in her good dress, the green one, which had been altered and trimmed for the occasion by the seamstress on 4th Street, and she looked at her husband, that word still new enough to carry its full charge, and she let herself be entirely happy, which she had not been entirely permitted herself to be in a long time. They went to the Double S that afternoon, which was now her home as well, and she stood in the kitchen of the house that Roscoe had built and looked around at the practical and honest construction of it, the good wood, the solid walls, the clean windows, and she thought, "This is mine now. This quiet, solid, honest life. This is mine." The house on the Double S was modest by the standards of what some Caldwell ranchers had built, but it was well made and had room to grow. The kitchen was large and had a good iron stove. There was a sitting room with a fireplace and a pair of bookshelves that Roscoe had built himself, and she noted with pleasure that they held both Tennyson and Whittier, which she took as a good sign. There was a bedroom with a window that faced east, so that the morning light came in gold and clean, and a second smaller room off the back of the house. She asked him what he used the second room for. He said, at present, storage. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything, but both of them were thinking something about the future, and the quality of the not saying was the warmest silence she had ever inhabited. The winter of 1883 passed, and then 1884 arrived, and the spring came across the Kansas plains with its usual extravagance, the grass greening and the creek running high from snowmelt and the prairie alive with sound. Delia taught through the spring semester and came home in the afternoons to the Double S, and she and Roscoe developed the shape of their life together with the same care and patience they had brought to everything. They were not people who rushed. They were not people who made noise. But they were people who noticed, who paid attention, who showed up for the things that mattered, and it turned out that this was a very good basis for a marriage. She discovered that he was an unexpectedly good cook for a man who had lived alone for several years, that he had a bone-dry sense of humor that emerged gradually, like water coming through stone, and that he was deeply uncomfortable with any form of personal illness, not because he was uncaring, but because being helpless in the face of something he could not fix or build or ride away from was a specific kind of torture for him. She teased him about this gently. He accepted the teasing with good grace. She discovered that he had been keeping a journal since he was 20, in the same kind of small leather-bound book, and that his handwriting was unexpectedly fine and beautiful, which made her laugh with a delight she could not have explained. He watched her laugh and looked like a man who has been given something he will spend the rest of his life being grateful for. In June of 1884, on a warm evening when the light was doing its particular long summer thing across the prairie, lying gold and horizontal over the grass, she told him she was expecting a child. He was in the barn with her, checking on a young horse that had been favoring its left foreleg, and she said it simply, without preamble, because she had learned from him that the true things were best said plainly. She said, "I am going to have a baby." He straightened up from where he had been crouched by the horse. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not immediately read, and then it resolved into something so openly full of feeling that she felt her own eyes sting. He crossed to her in 3 steps and put his hands on her face very carefully and said, "Are you all right?" She laughed because that was his first question. Of course it was his first question, of course. She said, "I am very well." He said, "Good." And he pressed his forehead against hers and stood there breathing, and she felt the full weight of his happiness in the particular stillness of him, the way big feelings in Roscoe expressed themselves not in motion, but in this kind of absolute concentrated quiet. She told the school board in August, knowing that her teaching in Caldwell was drawing toward a temporary close, at least through the pregnancy and the early months after. The board accepted this, Harold Finch being careful and kind about it, and they agreed that her position would be available to her when she chose to return, which was a more generous arrangement than was common in 1884, and which reflected the degree to which she had made herself indispensable over her 2 years of teaching. Their son was born in February of 1885. It was a hard labor, the kind that goes long and takes everything a woman has, and Roscoe spent the night in the kitchen of their house, listening to the sounds from the bedroom where the doctor and the midwife were working. And he was, by his own later admission, somewhere between prayer and collapse by the time the crying started. She had chosen the name James for her father. He held her hand when she told him this and said it was a good name. He said it was the best name he could think of. James Beckett Sawyer came into the world with a strong voice and his mother's eyes and his father's hands, and the storage room off the back of the house acquired a purpose that had been waiting for it. The spring of 1885 was different from the spring of 1884, which had been full of beginnings and discovery, the discovery of being with someone, the discovery of being known. The spring of 1885 was fuller. It was the fullness of something settled and chosen and built. It was early mornings with a new baby and the work of the ranch going on all around, and Roscoe up before light and back at noon to sit in the kitchen and eat, and hold his son with the same careful precision with which he did everything. And the look on his face when he held James was something Delia stored up like money. She went back to teaching in September of 1885. Tommy Hadley was by then old enough to be officially apprenticed to Roscoe on the Double S, which had been quietly arranged between the 3 of them over the past year. And Tommy, who was 12 and too big for the classroom and too good with animals to be anywhere else, came to the ranch 4 days a week and learned from Roscoe with the focused passion of a boy who has finally found where he belongs. Delia continued to give him books and argued his education with him in the evenings when he stayed for supper, which was often. Bill Hadley had sold his farm and moved on in the summer of 1885, destination unspecified, and nobody in Caldwell asked too many questions about where he had gone. Tommy remained under the informal guardianship that Delia and Roscoe had constructed around him, a guardianship that had no legal name but that was entirely real. Vera Aldridge moved to Wichita in 1886, her husband having taken a commercial opportunity there. Caldwell did not mourn her departure extensively, or at all, really. The town had moved on. The town was, in the way of cattle towns at the height of the trail era, always moving on, always taking in new people and losing others, always reinventing its own composition. Delia was no longer new. She was simply part of the fabric, the teacher, Roscoe Sawyer's wife, the woman on the double S who had good books and made her students recite poetry, and who was, by general consensus, the best teacher who had ever come through the Caldwell Township School. The school board had stopped being nervous about her by the middle of 1885. Harold Finch, who retired from the board in 1886, told Roscoe privately that his vote on the retention question was one he was proud of, which was something. And Roscoe told Delia about it that evening in the kitchen, and she considered it for a moment, and then said that she was glad he was proud of it and also that it should never have been a question at all, and Roscoe said, "Absolutely right," and that was the end of it. In the spring of 1887, James was 2 years old and walking with tremendous personal authority and a determination to investigate everything on the double S property, including the horses, the barn, the creek, and a family of prairie dogs that had established themselves near the fence line and which James regarded as a personal challenge. He had his grandfather's name and his mother's curiosity and his father's stubbornness, and between the three, he was already a handful of impressive proportions. Delia told Roscoe in March of 1887 that they were expecting another child. This time she told him in the kitchen over supper, and he set down his fork with a deliberateness that made her watch his face, and he said, "When?" She said, "September." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was calculating something. He said, "That is good timing for the ranch." She stared at him. He looked up at her with absolutely no expression, and then broke into the rare, transforming smile that she had been collecting for years, and she threw the dish towel at him, and James looked up from his bowl in alarm, and the kitchen was full of the sound of their laughter. Their daughter arrived in September of 1887. She was born with considerably less drama than James had been, arriving in the late afternoon in the golden fall light, and she was small and dark-haired, and looked up at Delia with an expression of absolute calm assessment that made Delia think of her mother and feel the grief and the gratitude simultaneously. They named her Clara for Delia's mother, and James spent 3 days regarding her with the deep suspicious uncertainty of a toddler encountering a rival, before deciding she was acceptable, and thereafter appointing himself her guardian with the same absolute authority he brought to all his undertakings. Roscoe with Clara was different from Roscoe with James in a way that was subtle but entirely visible to Delia, because she paid attention to him the way he paid attention to everything. He was the same, which is to say careful and precise, and full of a love that expressed itself in consistency and presence. But there was something additionally careful about the way he held Clara, something that she understood without having to ask, was about his mother, about the daughter of Cherokee women who had not lived to see her grandchildren, about all the things that get carried forward and are worth carrying. Delia held his hand one evening on the porch while Clara slept inside and James was in the barn with the horses, which had become his evening ritual, and she said, "Your mother would have loved her." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "My mother would have loved you." She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The prairie evening went on being magnificent, indifferent and enormous, and lit up with the particular orange and purple that the Kansas sky managed in the last hour of daylight. She said, "Tell me about her." He told her. He had been careful about this for a long time, careful about the information of his origin in the same way she had been careful about hers. But somewhere in the years they had built together, the careful had gradually been replaced by something easier and more honest. And he told her about his mother's name, Redbird, and about her hands and her voice and the way she had laughed, and Delia listened with the same whole attention with which he had always listened to her. And the name Redbird went into the double S's history, into the air of the house that they had built, and it belonged there. The years continued to pass with the pace that good years have, which is to say quickly and fully, each one containing more than the previous seemed to leave room for. Tommy Hadley grew into a man who could do with horses anything that Roscoe could do, and a few things nobody else in Caldwell had thought to try. And at 21, he began working the double S as a full partner, with Roscoe teaching him the management side as well as the physical work. Roscoe was 38 by then, and the silver at his temples had advanced to a significant portion of his hair, and it looked very well on him. James started school at Caldwell Township in the fall of 1890, which meant he was sitting in his mother's classroom, which was an interesting social experiment for both of them. He was not an easy student for the same reason Tommy had not been an easy student, because he was too fast and too interested and too unwilling to sit still when he could be moving. But he was also deeply competitive and discovered that school was a game that could be won. And once he understood this, he threw himself at it with characteristic Sawyer determination. Delia maintained strict professional impartiality in the classroom, and then came home and told Roscoe that their son was infuriating in the best way. And Roscoe listened with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose child is turning out to be exactly who you hoped they would be. Clara at 3 was philosophical and observant, and had a habit of appearing beside you suddenly without any noise, and looking at you with her calm dark eyes until you told her whatever you were thinking, because she clearly already knew something was happening and was simply waiting for you to confirm it. She and James were inseparable despite their difference in temperament, and the sound of their voices together in the yard was one of the regular musics of the double S in 1892. Delia received a letter from a woman named Ada Morse in Guthrie Junction, Oklahoma Territory, where this had all begun. Ada Morse was the daughter of a woman who had been a neighbor of the Beckett family, and she wrote to say that she had heard about Delia from her mother, and had wanted to tell her that her father James Beckett was remembered very fondly in Guthrie Junction by those who had actually known him, that he had been a man of integrity and warmth, and had helped her mother's family during a hard year with a generosity that had not been forgotten. Ada Morse was not making a political statement. She was simply passing along something she thought Delia should know. Delia sat at the kitchen table on a March morning and read the letter twice, and felt the long arc of her father's life reaching across the years and touching her, and she was grateful for it in the deep, private way that grief and love combine after enough time has passed. She wrote back to Ada Morse that evening. She told her what James Beckett's daughter had made of herself, the school and the ranch and the family, the 2 children and the husband and the life on the Kansas prairie. She thought her father would have been pleased. She thought he would have liked Roscoe, which made her smile in the kitchen light. Roscoe found her at the table writing and set a cup of coffee beside her without being asked, which was one of the 1,000 small fluent kindnesses that made up the daily grammar of their life together. She told him about the letter, and he read it and handed it back to her and said, "Good, just that, just good," but in his voice was everything that meant. The summer of 1893 was hot and difficult in Kansas, the drought that had been threatening for 2 seasons finally arriving in full force. The ranch work was harder that year, the creek lower, the grass thin and stressed. Roscoe made adjustments to the herd size with the pragmatic decisiveness that characterized all his business decisions, selling some cattle before the grazing quality dropped further, conserving water with new systems he and Tommy designed together using the knowledge Tommy had built up about the land. They came through the summer lean but intact, which was better than several neighboring operations managed. That fall, after the rains finally returned in October and the pastures began to green again, Delia and Roscoe sat on the porch of the Double S in the cool evening air and looked at their land, and she thought about the word there, about how long it had taken her to use it comfortably and how completely natural it felt now, the land and the house and the life that they had made together from the raw material of two careful, private people who had both been carrying their histories alone. She said, "I never thought I would have this." He looked at her. He said, "What specifically?" She gestured, a wide gesture that took in the house behind them and the barn and the pasture and the sound of James and Clara arguing about something in the kitchen. She said, "All of it." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I thought I would have the ranch. I thought I would always have the ranch." He paused. He said, "I did not think I would have anyone to have it with." She looked at him, at the silver-dark hair and the lines at the corners of his eyes that were deeper than they had been 10 years ago, and the expression that was, as always, direct and unperformed and fully his own. She thought about the church, about that Sunday morning in July of 1883 when he had stood up in the fifth pew and said, "I would like to speak," and about all the days that had grown from that moment, all the Sundays and Wednesdays and ordinary Tuesdays, all the mornings and evenings, all the conversations and silences, and the particular rich accumulated texture of a shared life. She said, "I am glad you were there that morning." He said, "I was always going to stand up." She said, "I know that now. I did not know it then." He said, "I know." He reached over and took her hand. He held it in the way he had held it since October of 1883, the same careful and certain grip, and they sat in the October evening, while inside the house their children moved and argued and lived with all the noisy confidence of people who had never spent a day of their lives wondering whether they were allowed to exist. Which was the most important thing, Delia thought, which was the whole point of everything, that the children should not know that weight. That James Beckett Sawyer and Clara Redbird Sawyer should grow up on this land without the heavy coat, without the careful calibration, without having to be strategic about their own truth. She had not been able to give them a world without prejudice. That was not within her power. What she had been able to give them was this: a father who had stood up when it mattered, and a mother who had not broken when they tried to break her, and a home where the true things were said plainly. She thought it was enough. She thought it was more than enough. She thought it was everything. In the years that followed, the Double S continued to grow. Tommy Hadley married a woman named Esther from a ranch in the southern part of the county in 1894, and they built a house on the east quarter of the Double S land that Roscoe had put in Tommy's name in 1893, which was the kind of thing Roscoe did without ceremony and without expecting acknowledgement, simply because it was right. Tommy and Esther had a son in 1895 and named him James after Delia's father, which was the kind of thing that catches you off guard with its fullness and takes you a moment to absorb. James Sawyer grew up and went to study law in Topeka in 1901, which was when Delia was 44 and Roscoe was 50, and she stood at the train station watching her son get on the train and felt the particular bittersweet pride that is the reward for doing your job well. Roscoe stood beside her with his hat in his hands and his face composed, and she knew him well enough to know that he was using every bit of his considerable composure to manage the moment. She slipped her hand into his elbow and felt him take a breath. Clara Sawyer did not go to law school. Clara Sawyer, at 17, announced that she intended to be a doctor, which was not something women generally did in 1902, but which was something women had been beginning to do, and Clara had the same quality her father had of stating her intentions simply, and then proceeding with absolute determination. She was accepted to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1903, which caused a scandal in Caldwell that Delia found she was able to regard with complete serenity, having had considerable practice with scandals. The morning Clara left was a clear September morning in 1903, the light coming in gold from the east as it always did through the bedroom window, and Delia sat on the edge of her bed for a moment before rising and held the quietness of the house around her. The changed quietness of a house that has had children in it for many years and is learning a new shape. Roscoe was already in the kitchen. He had made coffee. He was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the pasture when she came in, and she came to stand beside him, and they looked out at the same view that they had looked at from that window for 20 years. She said, "We did something right." He said, "We did a great deal right," she said. "I am incredibly proud." He said, "So am I," and then in the same tone, the same quiet level voice, he said, "And I love you precisely as much as I did in 1883, which is to say considerably more than I knew how to say then and more each year since." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the direct and serious gaze that had not changed, not in 20 years, not in any of them. The gaze that had always measured something private and entirely his own. And what it had always been measuring, she now understood, was her, the whole complicated, true, specific person of her, and had found what it was looking for and never stopped finding it. She said, "You are a very good man, Roscoe Sawyer." He said, "I have good people around me." She put her arms around him in the kitchen, in the September morning light, and he held her with the same force that was careful and absolute. And the coffee got cold on the counter, and neither of them minded at all. There was one more thing that needed to happen, which was this. In the fall of 1903, when Clara had gone and James was practicing law in Topeka, and the double S was quieter than it had been in years, Delia did something she had been thinking about for a long time. She wrote a letter to the Caldwell Clarion, which was the town newspaper, and she submitted it for publication. The letter was not angry and it was not a recrimination. It was a clear and measured account of her family history, her father James Beckett, her mother Clara, the years of careful performance and the costs of it. It named the injustice plainly. It did not ask for apology. It asked only for consideration. The editor of the Clarion, a man named Stuart Brooks who had come to Caldwell in 1895, and who had no personal stake in the events of 1883, published it in full on a Thursday in October. There was some response, mixed, as responses generally are. There were people who found it unnecessary or uncomfortable. There were also people, younger people mostly, and some older ones who had thought a great deal in the intervening years, who read it and felt something change in their understanding. Harold Finch, who was in his 70s by then, and lived in a smaller house in town after retiring from his various civic roles, sent Delia a note the following week. It said, "I have thought about that vote many times over the years. I believe we did the right thing in the end. I believe we should have done it sooner and with more conviction. I am sorry for the delay. It was not enough as an acknowledgement, but it was true and it came without prompting and she held it for what it was." Roscoe read the note and set it down on the kitchen table and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Better late than not at all," she said. "That is exactly what I thought." He said, "You are a very brave woman, Delia Sawyer," she said. "I had a very good reason to be." He looked at her from across the table with 20 years of mornings in his eyes and smiled, and she smiled back. And in the warm kitchen of the house they had built on the Double S Ranch 4 miles east of Caldwell, Kansas, the afternoon light came through the windows and fell across the table between them, and everything was all right. Everything was more than all right. It was the life she had traveled across the plains and through the tribunal and over the creek road and into the arms of one quiet, honest, remarkable man to build. And it was exactly, precisely, everything. The mare in the pasture was getting old now. The same chestnut mare that had caught Tommy Hadley's attention on a fence rail in 1883. And she moved slowly in the October light, but she was still there, still grazing, still moving through the grass with a kind of weathered dignity. The chestnut foal who had been born that long ago Saturday morning had his own foals now, the generations of the Double S turning over and continuing, the land and the horses and the people on them all moving forward in the same patient, determined way. Roscoe came out to the fence that afternoon to check the old mare, running his hands over her legs with the same careful attention he had always given the animals. And Delia came out behind him and leaned on the fence and watched him work, and the October sun laid itself across the pasture in a long golden stroke, and the air smelled of dry grass and autumn and the particular cleanness of the Kansas sky. He looked up from the mare and saw her watching him and said simply, "What?" She said, "Nothing. Just looking." He stood and came to the fence and leaned beside her, and they looked at the pasture together, the old horse and the younger horses and the flat horizon beyond, and she thought, this is what a life looks like when it works. This is what it looks like to have chosen well and been chosen well, and then done the daily work of it for 20 years without either of you flinching. She thought about the girl she had been in 1883, on the train to Caldwell with her leather trunk and her careful secret and her solitary determination, and she thought about what that girl had needed, which was someone who would see her clearly and not look away, someone who would stand up and say the true thing in a room full of people choosing not to, someone whose honesty was the same size as his silence. She had found him. She had found him at a fence and in a barn and over a table in the hotel dining room and on a creek road in October, and she had let herself, carefully and then entirely, be found in return. The double S was quiet in the autumn afternoon. Somewhere across the property, Tommy Hadley's son was doing something energetic in the yard by the small house on the east quarter, and you could hear the distant sound of a child being fully alive in the world. James Sawyer was in Topeka making arguments for people who needed someone to argue for them. Clara Sawyer was in Philadelphia learning to heal people, carrying her grandmother's name into a future her grandmother could not have imagined. The mare lowered her head and cropped at the grass. Roscoe put his arm around Delia's shoulders. The Kansas sky went on in every direction, as it always had, enormous and indifferent and impossibly blue, and underneath it 2 people stood at a fence in the long October light and were more than content, were the full and settled kind of happy that only comes after you have been through something and come out the other side together and chosen to stay. They stayed.